Welcome back. We want to talk about the Renaissance today. We're going to break this into a couple of lectures. I'm going to talk about it generally here, its origins. We're going to characterize it, give you some sense of chronology, significances. And then in our next lecture, we'll talk about Renaissance artistic conventions. We'll actually look at some paintings to see the shift in focus and emphasis that comes about because of the Renaissance. The definition, the word itself means rebirth. What we're rebirthing here in Europe during the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries is classical culture. And by classical culture, I mean ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Let's talk about historical chronology just a bit. As an historian, we take these things for granted. As non-historians, it may be confusing. So let me just break this chronology down for you a bit. Ancient history refers to classical history, the history of classical cultures, Greece, Rome, Egypt. Beyond ancient history is prehistory, which is a whole other field. It's a field that's more difficult because we don't have written records. The fall of Rome in about the 5th century generally signals the end of ancient history and the beginning of medieval history. Medieval history runs from approximately the 5th century, the fall of Rome, up until about 1500, sometimes called the Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages. I think some of the Renaissance figures referred to medieval times as the Dark Ages, putting themselves at the end of those Dark Ages where life becomes illuminated again. Pre-modern time runs up to about 1750, and then after 1750 we enter what historians call the modern era. Where does the Renaissance fit in with all this? Probably at the end of the medieval period, 15th, 16th centuries. Origins of the Renaissance. These are interesting. The fall of Constantinople, 1453, the Muslims overrun the Christian capital of Constantinople, and it becomes now the Muslim capital of Istanbul. So once the Muslims conquer Constantinople, there's just a flood of scholars bringing valuable manuscripts from antiquity westward. Many of these end up in Italy. We have also the invention of the printing press. This is revolutionary and will fundamentally change the pace of history. Think about going from handcrafted manuscripts to the mass production of books. Handcrafted manuscripts obviously take a very long time to produce. Mass production increases not only the number of books produced, but the cost is cheap, it goes down. There's an increased literacy here because of the printing press and the diffusion of literature across European society. Art and knowledge are no longer restricted to the literate few, the priesthood, the few nobility that have sufficient education. Let's further characterize the Renaissance here. A word that's thrown around a lot when we deal with the Renaissance is humanism. A shift in focus from God to man. We're going to see an increasing shift also from clerical to secular, which is really another way of saying the same thing. Clerical referring to the church, secular referring to the material world. We'll see this in Renaissance writing and Renaissance art. Of course, the Renaissance represents just an explosion of creative activity. And we see relics of the Renaissance all throughout Europe. The great paintings, obviously. Cathedrals, the churches, castles, fortresses, palaces, the monumental architecture that exists throughout the European continent. Some significances of the Renaissance. Well, it's going to hasten the transition in Europe from a feudal society toward the modern nation state. Again, the shift of focus from God to man. I've said that earlier, and that is a key significance. A rise of individualism. Once people become literate, they begin to interpret the Bible and other texts for themselves. And this leads to less groupthink and more individual think. You're going to see a rejection of previous authorities. Again, this is because people can actually read the texts for themselves. They don't need the intermediary of the priest or the bishop or the pope to interpret for them. They can read it themselves. We'll see this come to full fruition in the Enlightenment in a couple of centuries later. The Renaissance, of course, began in Italy. I think it's a fair question to ask why. If you look at the map, you can see that Italy is centrally located. It's in southern Europe, but it's centrally located in the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, it juts southward deep into the sea. As a peninsula, it has many visitors. It's a very cosmopolitan place. There are self-governing Italian city-states up and down the peninsula where trade takes place. So you have Jews and Arabs and Egyptians and people from Spain, people from southern France and Morocco, and just a variety of peoples with different languages, different traditions, different deities, different cuisines, different ways of dress. Attracted to Italy because of its central location and because of the trade that takes place there. And then, of course, you always have, in Italy, you have royal families or noble families. The de Medicis are probably the most famous. And quite often these families are enthusiastic patrons of the arts, supplying the capital needed by artists to create these fabulous works that we still see today. There's one other thing here I want to mention about the Renaissance, and that is the emergence of the vernacular languages. Vernacular simply means those local languages, the provincial languages, Italian, French, German, English, Portuguese, Spanish. You should remember that the overarching language of Christian Europe is Latin. Latin is the language of the church, and it's the language of the educated. After the invention of the printing press, we're going to find literature produced in vernacular languages, in the local languages, so that the locals can read it. The locals are not able to read Latin. They don't have that education, but they are going to begin to have available to them these classical works of antiquity in their own language. You see people like Petrarch and Erasmus and William Tyndale taking works of classical Europe and bringing them to the common people. William Tyndale is an especially interesting example of this. An Englishman, he took it upon himself to translate the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, into English so that the common people would have access to the Scripture. This strikes me as just a gargantuan task. It would take me 3 lifetimes to do this. Tyndale accomplished this, however, and then upon completion he decided that he would translate the New Testament into English so that the common people would have access to the Scripture. Of course, to do this, he would have to master Greek. So first Tyndale masters Hebrew to translate the Old Testament, and then he masters Greek to translate the New Testament. This is just a remarkable achievement in my mind. He paid a heavy price for it. He was executed on the orders of the King of England, Henry VIII in this case. I know it sounds counterintuitive that such a man could be executed for bringing the Bible to the common people, but of course what he's doing essentially is putting the church out of business, is he not? If we have the Bible in the language that we speak, then we don't need the priest and the bishop and the cardinals and the pope to interpret that Scripture for us. We can read it and interpret it ourselves. So Tyndale comes to a very bad end after doing a very good deed. Some conclusions here. You see in the Renaissance this notion that beauty and art for its own sake. celebration of man, celebration of our unlimited capacities. Human reason, you see sort of unleashed, human imagination. You see the power of the church, although still immensely powerful, you see it's diminished to some degree, and you'll see this culminate in the early 16th century, of course, with the Protestant Reformation. You see the emergence or the development of national schools in the Renaissance. By national schools, I mean a particular way of doing something. There's an Italian style, the French style, a German style, artistic conventions based on nationality, as opposed to the overarching earlier conventions of Christendom. And I mentioned the emergence of vernacular languages in the Renaissance. So in our next lecture, we'll look at a series of paintings, and we'll see how the Renaissance artistic conventions manifest themselves in these paintings. But I'm going to stop there for now. Thank you.